Gunfire erupted from all sides as Salvatore Giunta's world narrowed to chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the ridge as trees shattered and dirt exploded. His platoon was trapped in an ambush. There was no cover, nowhere to run. Then he saw it. 2 Taliban fighters dragging a body into the tree line. His sergeant, Brennan, bleeding but still alive. Giunta didn't think about the bullets. He didn't calculate the odds. He just went. By late 2007, the United States' war in Afghanistan had entered its 6th year. The opening salvo, Operation Enduring Freedom, had driven the Taliban from power in a matter of weeks in 2001. But victory had been an illusion. The Taliban hadn't been destroyed. They had disappeared into the mountains, into the caves of Tora Bora, across the border into Pakistan, and into the shadows of Afghan society. Afghanistan wasn't a conventional battlefield anymore. It had become a war of valleys and ridgelines, of IEDs buried in dirt roads, and ambushes hidden in silence. American forces weren't chasing an army, they were fighting a ghost, an insurgency that was as much ideology as it was firepower. The enemy didn't wear uniforms. They blended into the terrain, into the villages, into the very people the U.S. was trying to protect. Every patrol could end in an explosion. Every ridgeline could hide rifle barrels. Every ally could be a threat. The Korengal Valley was one of the deadliest hotspots in Afghanistan, and easily among the worst. Its narrow terrain, dense forests, and jagged ridgelines gave insurgents an edge. They could strike without warning and disappear like ghosts. Just miles from the Pakistani border, Korengal wasn't just a valley, it was a lifeline for the insurgents, a secret highway for smuggling weapons, fighters, and supplies deeper into the country. The American forces were stretched thin. Outposts were little more than fire bases carved into mountainsides. Troops patrolled on foot for days at a time, exposed, under-equipped, and often without air support. Every valley, every trail, every bend in the road could be lethal. The enemy was elusive, hard to find, harder to pin down. Villages were often hostile, or worse, too terrified to speak. Locals who cooperated risked brutal retaliation. In the Korengal, victory wasn't measured in ground taken, it was measured in patrols survived. If you made it back to base, that was a win. This was the context in which Operation Rock Avalanche was launched, not as a grand offensive, but as a disruption campaign. The mission was to keep Taliban fighters off balance, limit their freedom of movement, and buy time for winter to isolate them. The valley was only 6 miles long, but to the men who fought there, it felt infinite. A remote offshoot of the Pek River Valley in eastern Afghanistan's Kunar province, the Korengal cut like a jagged scar through the Hindu Kush Mountains. Steep slopes, dense pine forests, and narrow goat paths define the terrain. It was the ideal ground for an insurgency that had mastered ambush warfare. But to U.S. forces, it became known simply and ominously as the Valley of Death. From 2004 to 2010, American troops engaged in a bitter fight to control it. Dozens of soldiers were killed, hundreds more wounded. Entire fire bases were established, attacked, defended, and sometimes overrun. Every inch of progress was paid for in blood. Even holding a ridgeline often meant defending it under nightly attack. One of the most infamous of these outposts was the outpost Restrepo, named in honor of medic Juan Sebastian Restrepo, who was killed shortly after deployment. Perched high on a ridge above the Korengal, Restrepo wasn't carved out in safety. It was built under fire, with soldiers digging fighting positions with entrenching tools while exchanging bullets with Taliban fighters just a few hundred meters away. There were no showers, no running water, just sandbags, mud, and guns. The men of Battle Company lived there for months at a time, exposed, exhausted, and constantly under threat. The danger wasn't just the enemy, it was the terrain itself. The Korengal's topography gave insurgents a battlefield advantage. Narrow canyon walls funneled American patrols into predictable paths, exposed with little to no cover. Villages dotted the high ground, providing insurgents overwatch and lines of retreat. Artillery was of limited use due to the steep angles. Resupply required dangerous helicopter runs. Medevac flights often drew enemy fire. Taliban fighters moved quickly and with purpose. They used spotters, radios, and civilian lookouts to monitor American positions. They planted IEDs under rocks, triggered ambushes from elevated terrain, and vanished within seconds of an attack. They would often melt into the landscape before a counterattack could be mounted. American troops, in contrast, patrolled on foot with 100-pound packs, sweating through body armor, exposed to the ridgelines above. Every day was a coin toss. Every step could trigger an explosion. Every rustle in the trees could be the start of a firefight. For the Americans, the Korengal wasn't just hostile, it was strategic. Taking control of the region meant disrupting enemy movement and supply lines. It would be a crushing blow to the Taliban. And in the fall of 2007, Operation Rock Avalanche was launched, a final pre-winter push to disrupt insurgent activity and deny the Taliban sanctuary in the Korengal Valley. The goal was simple: flush out the enemy, hit them hard, and remind them that even in the most remote corners of Afghanistan, they were not safe. Among the soldiers on the ground was a U.S. Army paratrooper from the 173rd Airborne Brigade, Specialist Salvatore Giunta. He had no idea that within days he would be walking into a moment that would change his life and military history. His teenage years were ordinary. He worked part-time at Subway, hung out with his friends, and lived a life as average as it gets, until everything changed. At 17, lured by a recruiter's offer for a free t-shirt, Salvatore Giunta walked into a decision that would change his life. He enlisted in the United States Army, but he didn't take the easy path. He volunteered for one of the toughest jobs the Army had: airborne infantry. He was assigned to the 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team, based in Vicenza, Italy, an elite unit known for being first into the fight, often with little to no backup. Giunta deployed to Afghanistan for the first time in 2005, long before most Americans had even heard of the Korengal Valley, and that first tour changed him. The combat was constant, with daily gunfire, the distant thud of mortars, and patrols that dragged on for hours across brutal terrain in searing temperatures. Every step was a gamble against hidden explosives. He watched friends go down, one hit by sniper fire, another lost to a blast. Then it was his turn. A burst of gunfire ripped through his thigh. He would never forget the 4 soldiers killed in an IED attack. Firefights were fast and violent, erupting without warning. There were no front lines, just narrow goat trails, steep ridges, and forests thick enough to swallow sound. Every time his platoon crested a hill or stepped into a clearing, that feeling returned. The eerie, unshakable sense of being watched. The Americans rarely saw their enemy, but they knew they were out there. By 2007, Giunta was back in Afghanistan. This time, the 173rd Airborne Brigade had been deployed to Kunar Province, one of the most volatile regions in the country. Giunta and his fellow paratroopers were sent into the Korengal Valley. Life in the Korengal was relentless. Giunta's days were spent hauling 100-pound rucks up near vertical terrain. The nights offered no real rest, just the distant crack of gunfire, or worse, an unnerving silence that often signaled an ambush coming. The men lived in bare-bones outposts like Restrepo, where running water was non-existent and a hot meal was a rare luxury. At times, the only thing separating them from death was a wall of sandbags and the hope they didn't fall asleep first. They patrolled constantly, almost always on foot, moving deeper into the territory the Taliban knew far better than they did. Firefights became routine. In just one 15-month deployment, the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment was involved in more than 500 firefights, almost one every day. But despite the tight bond between Giunta and his fellow soldiers, something in the valley was wearing them all down. The enemy was unforgiving, striking whenever and wherever they could. Missions felt unclear, with objectives that shifted or blurred in the chaos. The villagers offered little help. Some were sympathetic to the Taliban, others too terrified to speak. Every resupply run was a gamble, and extraction missions were even more dangerous. By October 2007, the U.S. Army was deep into its 6th year of combat in Afghanistan, and its patience with the Korengal Valley was wearing thin. Insurgent attacks were increasing, casualties were mounting, and the valley's steep terrain and network of sympathetic villages had turned it into a fortified corridor for Taliban and al-Qaeda-linked fighters. If America wanted to disrupt the insurgency before the winter, they would have to take the fight directly into one of the most lethal places on Earth. And that fight was called Operation Rock Avalanche. It began on October 19, 2007, an ambitious offensive led by elements of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, Giunta's battalion. The objective was to push deep into Taliban-controlled territory on foot and clear the Korengal Valley village by village. The order was to eliminate or drive out as many enemy fighters as possible before winter covered the mountains in ice and made the fight even more difficult. But the enemy was waiting. Before boots even touched the ground, Chinook helicopters ferrying troops into the valley came under coordinated fire. As they hovered over exposed ridgelines, the sky lit up with RPGs and small arms fire. One Chinook narrowly avoided disaster. Insurgents had dug in, just 1,600 feet from the landing zone. The soldiers knew at once there was no turning back. Every drop of water, every bullet, every meal had to be hauled on their backs. Helicopter resupply was a gamble. Any aircraft flying into the Korengal became a target the moment it appeared over the ridgeline. Very soon the mission began to unravel in real time. Villages marked as neutral turned hostile. Cleared routes became ambush zones laced with IEDs. Roads became traps, and every day delivered yet another brutal, unpredictable firefight. The valley was fighting back and it wasn't giving up an inch. The soldiers of Battle Company, operating out of Firebase Restrepo, were in constant contact with Taliban fighters. They experienced multiple firefights in a day, often at close range. These weren't distant skirmishes, they were brutal face-to-face ambushes, erupting from as little as 65 to 330 feet away. In most cases, the first volley of gunfire determined who lived and who didn't. There was a lingering sense of tension that hung in the air. Intel reports warned that something bigger was coming, a coordinated assault more dangerous and deliberate than anything they'd faced so far. The valley was holding its breath, and so were the men. And on October 25th, that attack came. Giunta's platoon was on the move again. They'd been out for days carving a path through the jagged vertical terrain between the Shuryak and Korengal valleys. Fatigue was setting in. The air was thin, the climbs punishing. Every step felt like a personal battle. The enemy hadn't shown themselves yet, but no one believed they were gone. In the Korengal, silence was never peaceful. It was a warning. That day had been spent sweeping steep ridgelines for insurgents hoping to make it back to base before dark, but time slipped away and the sun vanished behind the mountains. They were still far from safety. Darkness began to engulf the valley, but the moonlight was just bright enough to navigate without night vision goggles. A small blessing. The goggles narrowed vision too much for comfort on terrain like this. Instead, they moved in staggered file one by one along a narrow trail carved into the hillside. Just a line of dark shapes moving through deeper darkness, exposed and vulnerable. Giunta was second in line, right behind Staff Sergeant Eric Gallardo, and just ahead of Sergeant Joshua Brennan. Behind them, Specialist Frank Eckrode, Medic Specialist Hugo Mendoza, and Privates First Class Caleb Casey and Garrett Clary. A steep rock wall rose to their left, and to their right, a sheer drop into the darkness. It was perfect terrain for an ambush. The soldiers knew this was a bad situation. They just hoped to make it back to the base. And then all hell broke loose. It happened in seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. The platoon had walked straight into a textbook L-shaped ambush. It was the kind of attack drilled into insurgents in training camps and perfected through years of war against both the Soviets and Americans. This trail wasn't random. It had been watched, mapped, and measured. The enemy knew the terrain. They knew exactly where the kill zone began and where it ended. The insurgents had waited until the patrol was fully committed, stretched thin along a narrow mountain path. No cover, no room to maneuver, and no chance for immediate air support. The first shots rang out, sharp, disciplined bursts from AK-47s. They came from the elevated positions above and ahead of the patrol, aimed with purpose. These were kill shots designed to cut off the front of the line, to decapitate the unit's leadership and plunge the rest into chaos. Sergeant Joshua Brennan, third in line, was hit almost immediately. Multiple rounds slammed into his chest and lower abdomen, dropping him hard. Behind him, Specialist Frank Eckrode was the next to fall, also critically wounded. In an instant, the patrol's tight formation collapsed and the men descended into survival mode. Soldiers scrambled for whatever they could find. Rocks, shallow cuts in the earth, anything to shield them from the storm of gunfire erupting from the ridgeline. The mountainside lit up with muzzle flashes, the air filled with shouting, bullets, and the unmistakable sound of men fighting to live. But this was just the beginning. Rocket-propelled grenades screamed through the tree line above, streaking toward the patrol. They slammed into trees, rocks, and cliff faces, detonating with thunderous force that shook the mountain. Each blast compressed the air, rattled the lungs, and filled the night with choking dust and flying debris. One round exploded near Staff Sergeant Eric Gallardo, knocking him to the ground. Shrapnel tore into his body, and the concussion wave slammed the breath from his chest. From Giunta's position, it looked like Gallardo had taken a direct hit to the head. For a moment, he thought his squad leader was gone. The ambush had done its job. The patrol was split. The forward element, Brennan Eckrode and medic Hugo Mendoza, was trapped in the kill zone, fully exposed to sustained overlapping fire raining down from the high ground. Behind them, the rest of the squad was pinned in place, unable to move forward without walking straight into the line of fire. Specialist Giunta, second in line, and only meters behind Gallardo, didn't hesitate. He dropped into a crouch, opened fire, and then charged forward, straight into the storm. Bullets whipped past him, kicking up dirt and stone. One round slammed into his chest plate, knocking the wind out of him, nearly dropping him. Another tore through his gear, shredding a magazine pouch. But Giunta didn't stop. He reached a dazed and bleeding Gallardo and dragged him to partial cover. With rounds still zipping through the air, they quickly located Casey and Clary, pinned under Relentless machine gun fire. Together, they regrouped and began laying down suppressive fire. Tracer rounds and muzzle flashes lit up the night. The enemy held the high ground, the visibility, and the advantage of coordination. There were at least 2 fire teams firing in precise bursts, containing the patrol in overlapping kill zones. This wasn't random gunfire, it was an execution. And Giunta knew that if no one acted fast, they were going to die on that mountain. High above, 2 American gunships watched helplessly. The Taliban fighters were too close in proximity to the American soldiers. The risk of collateral damage was too high. The team's medic specialist Hugo Mendoza had already been killed, struck in the femoral artery and bleeding out through his leg. Without him, wounded soldiers had to rely on field dressings and tourniquets from their own kits. Giunta knew 2 of his brothers, Brennan and Ekrode, were still out there, but the volume of fire made movement seemingly impossible. But they made the decision anyway. They were going to push forward. One soldier laid down fire while the other sprinted forward, leapfrogging uphill through darkness and incoming rounds. It was close quarters mountain warfare at its most brutal. There was no cover, no margin for error. Giunta hurled M67 fragmentation grenades toward the flicker of enemy muzzle flashes, each explosion buying a few precious seconds of shock and disarray. As the blasts tore through the tree line, they surged forward, 6, maybe 10 yards at a time, and then again and again. They were pushing directly into enemy fire, and just as the team crested the slight rise in the trail, Giunta spotted something that made his blood run cold. 2 Taliban fighters were dragging Sergeant Brennan's limp body into the forest. He was still alive, barely. His vest had been stripped off. He wasn't being left behind, he was being taken. And for Giunta, that was unthinkable. Giunta didn't shout, he didn't signal, there was no time, he just moved. Charging alone into a hail of bullets, Giunta left behind what little cover he had and sprinted toward the enemy, his M4 carbine raised, firing on the run. Each footstep was a gamble. Every tree might conceal another shooter. Every second his body was exposed. But Giunta's mind had narrowed to one thought: they are not taking him. One of the Taliban fighters turned, eyes wide, just in time to catch a burst of 5.56mm rounds to the chest. He dropped instantly. The other tried to flee, dragging Brennan a few feet further before ditching him and vanishing into the trees. Giunta squeezed off another burst. The second fighter was hit, possibly fatally, but vanished into the darkness. Giunta dropped to their knees beside Brennan. He was in bad shape, bare-chested, riddled with bullet wounds, his face pale and gasping for air. His blood soaked the dirt beneath him. Giunta grabbed Brennan by his vest harness and began pulling him back down the hill toward what remained of the squad. Behind him, bullets still tore through the trees, but he kept moving, shielding Brennan with his own body, yelling for covering fire. As they reached a shallow depression near a rock shelf, more soldiers arrived. Clary, Gallardo, and the others. They formed a defensive perimeter, returned fire, and radioed for medevac. Giunta leaned close to Brennan, trying to keep him conscious. "You're gonna be fine. You'll get out and tell your hero stories." Moments later, the medevac bird, a Black Hawk, thundered in low through the valley, blades chopping the air as it hovered under fire. As dust and debris whipped on around them, medics rushed out, braving enemy rounds, to hoist Sergeant Joshua Brennan into the helicopter. Giunta stood nearby, his uniform soaked in Brennan's blood, watching as the Black Hawk lifted off and disappeared into the fading light. They had done it. They had brought him home. Later, Giunta would learn who he had been up against. The insurgent he killed wasn't just any fighter, it was Muhammad Tali, a known insurgent leader and high-value target according to U.S. intelligence. Despite Giunta's best efforts, tragedy was unavoidable. Sergeant Brennan's injuries proved too severe. He died in surgery the next morning. For his actions, Giunta was recommended for the Medal of Honor. On November 16, 2010, in a ceremony at the White House, Giunta became the first living recipient of the Medal of Honor since Vietnam. He stood at attention as the medal was placed around his neck by President Barack Obama. But the award made him deeply uncomfortable. "If I'm a hero, every man that stands around me, every woman in the military, everyone who goes into the unknown is a hero," Giunta said. Now go check out the insanely crazy story of a tiny soldier, or click on this video instead.